including the shocking death of NFL quarterback Steve McNair in 2009. John Fugelsang is a comedian, actor, and political commentator who has appeared on The Wendy Williams Show and The Daily Show. He has a new radio show premiering on Sirius XM.
And Gwendolyn Lindsay Jackson is a familiar face to Arise TV. She is a criminal, civil, and military attorney and appears as a legal analyst on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. Welcome, everyone, to our very first Arise and Shine round table.
Thank you.
All right, so let's jump in and talk about the allegations against Bill Cosby. John? We've heard the allegations against Bill Cosby for years now. So why are they sticking now?
Well, I think no one wanted to believe this.
Okay.
Over the years, as we've heard more and more allegations, no one's wanted to believe it. I didn't want to believe it when Bill Cosby made Ghost Dad.
Right.
So, when it's someone that you've loved and admired your whole life and has done so much to help so many other people and is known for so many civil rights and humanitarian and artistic achievements. However, Hannibal Buress, the comedian, is getting a lot of credit for reigniting this firestorm with his on-stage set about Cosby. I really think we're talking about it now because women have come forward. And I do think that while Mr. Cosby will never go to trial, and he will certainly face punishment whether he did it or not, it certainly seems that he's done it if you look at how all of these allegations match up, but he is innocent until proven guilty. He will receive punishment. I think the positive side of this story is that so many women came forward, and that it's never been harder in history to get away with abusing a woman or a child than it is today. It's still far too easy, but previous generations, you were a victim.
Well, and I think that's why so many women didn't come out in the 70s and the 80s, because they really didn't feel as though anything would have been done. But now there's actually been 30 women who have shared their stories, including supermodels like Janice Dickinson, Beverly Johnson. Yet the interesting thing is it seems like the public is still divided on whether or not he's innocent or guilty. I mean, why is that?
As they should be.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with the old allegation of, well, why'd you wait 30 years to report this? Or it's Bill Cosby, Dr. Huxtable, he couldn't have done this. People are always going to have that perception.
Right, Gwendolyn?
Well, I think the power of social media had a lot to do with all of this coming to fruition, because when you think about it, he invited people to mime him. And when he did that, the floodgates were open, and then that's really what drove everything, because let's face it, a lot of people knew about these women. I mean, it's not like they were silent, but I think the power of social media bringing it forward has forced the world to put eyes on Bill Cosby.
But as a legal analyst, what is your take on it?
Well, I think that, number one, he is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. I think that Bill Cosby only has to worry about one case right now, and that is a civil suit by Judith Huth. And I'll tell you why that's important, because Judith Huth alleged that he molested her when she was 14 or 15. And what's interesting about that is the statute of limitations for bringing a civil suit for a minor that has been molested is extended because it's 3 years, I believe, in the state of California from the date that you realize that you have been injured psychologically. So that's the only case he really needs to worry about. And also if there are any other cases that may follow on, if there are any additional molestation cases. But from a criminal standpoint, he's not going to face any charges because the statute of limitations for criminal cases are definitely over and have not been extended.
Exactly.
But what do you guys think about the public reaction? I mean, it seems like a lot of people are really finding this tough to believe.
Well, of course. I'm a comedian, and I will say Bill Cosby is the greatest live comic I've ever seen. I saw Rain's dad. I saw George Carlin, but Cosby is unreal in his talent. But it's important to realize in a situation like this that we sort of, as a culture, have to separate the artist from the man. John Lennon beat his first wife. Am I obliged to throw out my Beatle albums? Picasso was horrible to women. Am I obliged to devalue his art because of the man's personal failings? So I do think that you can say that this is a guy who's has done so much for others, has donated so much money to black colleges, done so much work for civil rights, and he may clearly be a deeply flawed individual.
But I
and that's okay.
I'm sorry, but I think people are having a hard time understanding why it's coming out, because they think this is a black man who allegedly committed these acts against predominantly white women 30 or 40 years ago. Why wasn't he prosecuted? Why wasn't he sued?
So do you think this is a racial issue? Do you think this is coming out because it's, do you know what I mean? Because it's coming out during the time. Look, it's hitting at Ferguson. It's hitting at Eric Gardner. It's hitting right now during this very racially
I wouldn't even
intense
say it's
time.
racial. I would say it's what's right and what's wrong. I mean,
Okay.
if you're a victim, you're a victim, whether you're white, black, or whatever.
Right.
So it's coincidence.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely
It's
coincidence.
racial to the extent that a person of color who's achieved vast wealth and power in society can get away with things
Right.
that Caucasians with vast power and wealth can get away with.
I mean,
Okay.
there's multiple issues here. It's not just race, it's also socioeconomic class and the fact that, like you said, people who are considered famous or powerful, sometimes the victims don't feel like they really have a chance to, fight against somebody like that.
Right.
I know you were mentioning, though, that you do think that this is a little bit of a racial issue,
I
right?
think it is,
Yeah.
and the reason, as I said before, I think it is because people are having a hard time rectifying in their minds why didn't anything happen to this black man that
Right.
committed these alleged acts against white women. We were very polarized in the 60s and 70s. Why didn't they come forward at that point? Not to say that they haven't, they don't have a right now to come forward, and we
Right.
always want to hear from the victims. And also the fact that it's happening now. The media, the timing.
Right.
When we're really revisiting civil rights and we're
Right.
taking down
do you
another
think,
icon.
so can I break it down even further?
Yes.
So because you're bringing up the issue of race, do you think then this is almost like an attack on the black dominant male, like we saw in the days of slavery? We put him on the auction block.
I think so.
To say, okay.
Absolutely think so. I'm not saying that Bill Cosby didn't commit these
Right.
horrific acts,
Right.
but I think in terms of the timing, and
Right.
in terms of, I guess, the fervor and how they're going after him in the media, I think it is.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you have to look at it like this as well. There's plenty of victims that have been victim of date rape or casual rape that wait years to report it, even if they report it at
Right.
all. I mean, they may
Exactly.
not report it because of embarrassment, retaliation, or for whatever reason. So to say, oh, well, they waited 30 years doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen or that they
Right.
weren't a
Right.
victim at that
Exactly.
time.
And there may be many women of color who have not yet come forward about
Right.
Bill Cosby. But when Phil Spector shot and murdered someone, no one said, "Oh, what does this mean for the white guy with Afro community?"
Right.
No one made that
Right.
about
Right.
race. And,
Yeah.
and when you look at the major cases this year, what we see is in the case of Ferguson and Staten Island, low-income black men who were
Right.
killed for jaywalking and selling loose cigarettes.
Right.
Then you can see Cosby and Ray Rice, powerful, wealthy black men
Right.
who committed violence against women
Right.
and walked away.
Right.
And
So
my
the
dad
only
shot
color that
cars
matters
and-
is
and
lack
got
of
away
green.
with it.
The color that
Just
matters is
saying.
lack of green in this case.
Right.
Right, yeah,
Exactly.
that's a good point. Well, I want to talk about Bill Cosby's wife. She's obviously
Yes,
been standing by him throughout all of these allegations. She said, "The man I met and fell in love with is a kind man, a generous man, a funny man, and a wonderful husband, father, and friend. He is the man you thought you knew." How do you guys feel about the fact that she's sticking by him? I mean, would you... if you were in a similar
Stand by
situation,
your
stand by your
Well,
partner. I
being
know
the
it's
only-
hard to imagine.
Being
this-
the only woman guest here,
Right.
let's say this, I would be divorced years ago if I were married to Bill Cosby. But
Even Bill
I'm not-
Cosby? He's so
I'm
wealthy.
not Camille
Jell-O
Cosby.
pudding pops,
I
come
know, but Camille Cosby, when you think about her, she is a very eloquent woman.
Right.
She's very professional. She's also, I think, has been his manager.
Right.
They
So
have
there's
built an
that.
empire together. So I
Right.
think when you have that level of
She's protecting
financial
the brand.
backing, absolutely, she has to
Right.
protect the brand. She has to
Right.
protect the money. They have 4 children together. They're grown. They have grandchildren. And, Bill Cosby has done a lot for historic black colleges.
Right.
She's spoken at some of the events that he sponsored. So I think in her mind, it's an investment, a 50-year investment,
Right.
half a century investment.
It's not just a regular
And it's
relationship.
hard to
And
give that
Hillary
up.
stood by Bill Clinton. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And,
Well, it's
again,
easy
this
to-
isn't allegations of rape, but she stood by her
Bill
man.
Clinton was accused
Right.
of rape
Right.
as well, and this may, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, she's the Carmela Soprano of comedy-wise,
Right.
but the
Right.
fact is that they raised children together, they buried a son together, they
Yes.
have a 50-year marriage, and I don't malign anyone who honors their wedding vows and stays with their
Right.
partner.
And you have to look at acceptance versus ignorance. I mean, did she know what was
Well,
going on?
that's the real...
I mean,
Cosby had to admit fathering a child out of wedlock
Right.
10 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
it hasn't
Right.
been smooth sailing all the way.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of people would say that she must have known that this was going on for so long. So it's not, her reaction might not be that shocking.
Right. So whether any of this actually goes to trial, this case is getting tried in the court, like we were talking about, a public opinion. And that being said, what is your opinion?
Do you think he's guilty or innocent?
well, there are too many allegations not for for something to have been there,
Right.
And especially with social media, everybody's guilty these days.
Yeah.
It takes 30 seconds to, just blast someone on social media. So It can go from 30 seconds you're nobody to 30 seconds later you're like, this guy's like dirty. This guy did this. This guy did that. So.
Well, I really don't want to just say that he is 100% guilty because he hasn't been tried in a court.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, and in the 70s, you had a lot of people popping pills.
Yeah.
There was a lot of, free sex going around.
There
And we
was
really
free
don't
love.
know what happened in all of these
Let me
instances.
tell you what happened.
Go ahead. I'm not trying to say that he hasn't done this to one or two, but all of the women sort of piling on, you have to think. Maybe there is some piling on. Maybe they were partying. Maybe they were popping pills in the 70s.
Right.
There will be no trial, most likely, but a sentence has been passed, and there will be punishment. And for the rest of his life, he will carry this burden of being a national ghoul.
Right.
People will always believe he did it, and he will be paying a price for the rest of his time on Earth.
And so will the kids who are not going to get scholarships anymore because you have Spelman College.
Well, then
that
you
is
have
cutting
someone else.
off.
But see,
Everyone's
then you need
terrible
someone else
issues.
to step up. I think someone else now needs to step up. So to say, like, I feel bad for the kids that aren't going to get scholarships, I think there's opportunity, and this is where the community gets to step in and almost like choose a new person. Jay-Z, hop on out there.
He's still got gazillions of dollars. No one's going to turn down scholarship money.
Exactly.
But
Well,
there
turned down
are
the
a lot
grants.
of
Jay-Z's got
institutions
his
that
own
are
issues.
trying to distance themselves
Right.
from him because they don't want to be associated with that.
Right.
But how do you guys think that all of this is going to affect his legacy? Do you think people are really going to be able to separate Bill the entertainer from Bill the rapist?
Not if they can't see his reruns anymore. If you have people dropping
True.
Cosby reruns and Fat Albert reruns, you'll have a generation that just forgets about him, to say nothing of the people who worked on their shows who will no longer get the residual payments they counted on in reruns for decades once they're
True.
pulled.
Yeah.
There are many victims here.
Yep.
Definitely affected him negatively. I don't
Right.
think he's ever going to be able to perform live anymore in the United
He'll
States.
still- I think he'll
really
still-
think he's going to have a hard time.
And he can still do, if Ted Nugent can threaten the president's life and still sell out, rodeos, he can do this.
Oh,
Bill Cosby is still
right.
the greatest stand-up I've ever seen perform live, and he
Yeah.
will still do 40 to 50 dates a year.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things also is that he's really remained silent about this and really has said maybe uttered a sentence about it and refuses to talk about it. But we have so much more that we want to talk about in the show. Coming up next, the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri has struck a turbulent chord throughout communities large and small. When we return, we'll look at where we stand in the aftermath and how we can move forward in the coming year. Don't go away. You're watching Arise and Shine. Welcome back to our first roundtable discussion here at Arise and Shine. We're joined by comedian John Fugelsang, legal analyst Gwendolyn Lindsay Jackson, and true crime author/radio host Vincent Hill.
Let's talk now about Ferguson. Prior to August of 2014, most of us had never heard of Ferguson, Missouri. But since then, it has become the symbol of racial unrest on a scale not seen since the civil rights movement of the 60s. Ferguson was just the beginning of the conflict between police and civilians. Gwendolyn, this wasn't the first time an event like this has happened since the 60s, and it probably won't be the last, as we know. So why do you believe this story struck such a chord with the people, and why is this one that has opened now the floodgates?
Well, I think primarily black and brown people, people of color, we're just fed up. We're tired of dying. Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and you have the Ferguson case. We're sick and tired of it. And I think it's an indictment on the American judicial system. You have a toxic cartel, in effect right now, where you have judicial deference to police. Whatever they do is correct, and then you have this other aspect of expanding police authority with stop and frisk.
But here's a question. It's the fraternal order of police for a reason. So is that to be uncommon, or are we to accept it?
I don't think we should accept it at all. And I think it's unconscionable that you have this blue wall of silence. I mean, look what happened with Mayor de Blasio. They turned their backs on the mayor when he was speaking at some of the funerals. These are people who are in uniform. I think that's reprehensible, and I think it's a culture that needs to be taken down.
Right, and I think, and that's what I'm saying. I think it is because it's a fraternal order. It's almost like we stand separate from. What do you think?
I mean, so Vincent, I'm curious too to ask you, because you're obviously a former law enforcement officer. You know, I actually happened to be in Ferguson in the aftermath of the incident. I was there for a few weeks. I got tear gassed myself. And there's many layers to this story. It's part of it is about race, like we just discussed, but it's also about gun control. You don't see this kind of stuff happening in other countries. What do you think this story is really about? Is it about race, or is it about gun control?
Well, I would say neither. Gun control, first of all, police are authorized to carry weapons. And, you know, truthfully, gun control in this country is a joke, in my opinion. I mean, I can go down the street and get a gun here in 30 seconds or less. But to say every incident is racial, you have to look at what steps led to the incident, what steps led to the death. I mean, when you look at why Officer Wilson wasn't indicted, you had a grand jury of 12 people who saw Michael Brown, this 6'6" large guy, in the store assaulting someone. 9 minutes later,
Officer Wilson didn't know that. That's immaterial.
This is true. This is true. But my point is, when Officer Wilson did make contact with Michael Brown, he said, "Hey, you two need to get out of the street." And even Dorian Johnson said, "Well, we told him we're almost there, so we continued to walk down the middle of the street." So had Michael Brown and Dorian just complied with that officer's commands, I think the outcome would have been a lot different.
But surely you can understand the leap
that.
between going from, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
Please.
So I think there's a problem with this whole issue of we had a grand jury because there were so many problems with the process. It was manhandled by the prosecutor, who many people think should have stepped down. And I think in instances like this, there should have been an independent prosecutor. And the grand jury, I think, is very suspicious because none of these witnesses were actually really aggressively cross-examined.
And we also know that witness 40 lied on the stand, and the prosecutor said he didn't mind that she lied on the stand. He wanted to put all witnesses up, whether they were telling the truth or not. The reason why this caused so much unrest is because this young man, who may have been a terrible person, he was going to college, but the fact is he was unarmed, he was shot 6 times, twice in the head, no trial.
So this,
6 bullets in the body, 2 in the head, no trial.
Then is a reflection of possibly of the misuse of authority?
I think it's both. I think it's race and I think it's abuse.
It's hard
and especially
to indict.
in the Eric Garner case.
It's, it's hard to indict an officer that was acting in the line of duty. Now, it would be different if Officer Wilson just stepped to Michael Brown, fired a shot. But when you have he was acting in the line of duty, when he says he approached me in the vehicle, he fought me in the vehicle, I couldn't get my pepper spray because it was against the door, I couldn't get my aspartame, I used what I had to do. It's hard to prosecute or indict an officer acting in the line of duty.
So I agree with that. Obviously, the way that the legal system is set up, it makes it hard to indict a police officer when they're, you know, responding to an incident. But even beyond that, just
there was no incident he was responding to.
Well, yes, you're right. But you know what I mean. That it's hard when a police officer says that he feels threatened to then go on and indict that officer. However, if you look at the misuse of police authority, you also have to look at the aftermath, right? I mean, after this happened, the police came out with their riot gear on, and then we saw tanks going down the street in Ferguson. I mean, was that really necessary? A lot of people said, you know, that actually put more fuel to the fire.
Absolutely did, especially when you see the police in this militarized gear and the way they were manhandling the crowd, and also a lot of the people in the media got shoved around by the police.
Yep, including
and I
me.
think that's a very, very dangerous precedent to set.
When I want to see a bunch of middle-aged white guys with military hardware they don't earn, I'll watch an Expendables movie. You know what I mean? In this case, you know, this was a matter of a policeman who was never questioned and no one ever disputed his account.
Yeah.
We have a society where we have a large amount of people who don't trust the American government. They don't believe anything the government tells us unless an unarmed black person has been killed by a cop. In that case, I don't need to hear anything else. I trust whatever the official party line is.
Right.
And just as the officer Wilson is entitled to being innocent until proven guilty, well, so is Michael Brown.
Right.
And no one ever questioned his account that this guy reached into a car and tried to wrestle. I mean, he could have stepped on the gas. He could have called for backup. He didn't file a report, and he left the body lying there in the street for hours.
Right.
People didn't want him strung up.
Well, he didn't
People
leave the
wanted a
body
trial.
there.
People wanted a trial.
Well, the police department
Well,
did,
you have to look. You have to process a crime scene. That doesn't take 10 minutes.
Right,
I mean,
right.
you have to
Which
process
doesn't
a
take 10
crime
hours
scene.
either.
So,
Yeah.
right,
And
it
no
was
one
4
wanted
hours.
him strung
Right.
up. People, in the case of Trayvon Martin, after that murder, there were no riots. There was no civil unrest because people just wanted a trial. They weren't happy with the results, but they accepted that justice, imperfect though it might be, was
At least,
served.
right.
There was no trial here, and a trial would have cleared Officer Wilson if he is as innocent as he has claimed.
Right. That's
And so
definitely
this
true.
may be a structure of institutionalized racism that exists for years and decades in Ferguson, Missouri. I mean, this isn't something
And
that
that's
just goes
something that
away.
the Justice
I don't think
Department
it's
is
just
looking
Ferguson.
into.
I think it's not just Ferguson. I
Right.
think it's in New York. I think it's something
Cleveland
national.
Right.
You know, and I think this is something we really need to look at, especially when you're talking about grand juries. Normally, it's very easy. The bar to get a grand jury to indict is a low bar.
Right.
It's, you know, you basically are able to do it. But whenever it's a police officer and it happens to be a person of color that's shot, you don't even get a trial. And I think the trial would have cleared things up in our minds. We want to know a lot of allegations are what did Mike Brown do? What did the cop do?
All right,
Hold
but
on. So
Vincent,
we
We need to see it
Here's why I
trial.
would disagree with that. Dylan Taylor, an unarmed white guy in Denver, Colorado, was shot a week after Michael Brown. Same scenario. No indictment for that officer.
Right.
So again, we can't say every police shooting, every police incident is racial.
No.
Right.
Again,
We're
it
not
is
saying
almost
everyone,
impossible
but
when an officer is acting in the line of duty
But
to indict that officer.
overwhelmingly, it is about race. And there are going to be issues of injustice. There are going to be, you know, there are white people, there are Caucasian people that are victims of injustice in this system. But when you have a system that is not accountable, that is completely not accountable, I think that is a danger. So everyone is
And speaking of accountability, I know, Priya, you were going to talk about the...
Well, so I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts are on the role of the media in all of this. Obviously, you know, as we all just pointed out, there's several incidents that happen on, you know, unfortunately, it's too common here in the United States, but for some reason, this one is, you know, fired up the whole country, and people are talking about it around the world. What do you guys think about the media's coverage of what's going on in Ferguson?
The media doesn't seem to know the difference between protesters, rioters, and looters. And if you have 20,000 nonviolent protesters and 20 who go violent, the media will cover the 20 who went violent because we live in a for-profit media society that depends on ratings, and that controls the flow of information. However, I'd like to see the media take a step back and say that this isn't, at its core, a racial issue. This is an issue of poverty. This is an issue of social injustice, 30 years of widening income inequality. And poverty hurts policemen. Poverty hurts middle-class white people just as much as it hurts low-income black and white people. And the fact is, you start getting serious about solving these problems, and cops don't have to go after quality-of-life offenses like jaywalking and selling loose cigarettes. And you know, we had a period in this country from the 50s to the 70s where low-income black and white people really could climb the economic ladder. We're in an age now where the American dream has gone from prosperity to just scraping by, and I would submit to you that these incidents aren't necessarily the problem, but more symptoms of a much deeper problem that's not going away,
Right.
and it
Right.
sadly may take a lot more injustice and crime and murder before the society does something.
Well,
about it.
I disagree when you say it's not about race.
Right.
I think
Oh, it's
that it
about
is
race, but
about
at its
race.
core, at its
I
core.
think at the core it is race. And I think when you have a systemic system
Right.
of racial injustice as the umbrella
Right.
in the United States
Right.
of America, where it trickles down into the
So then,
judicial
Gwendolyn,
system, that's the problem.
Then
you have to tackle.
No
Gwendolyn,
doubt.
hold on,
Yes.
Gwendolyn, John. So
Right.
then my question, because okay, we've tapped on it's race,
Right.
we've tapped on that it's systemic. What do we do to then solve the issues? How do we begin to resolve and find some kind of common ground or change to be effective?
Well, I think number one, speaking as a black
Yes.
person, because
Yes.
I can affect as a black person.
As a black
we
woman.
need to understand,
Yes.
right, as a black woman, that racism exists. And I think for
Right.
people to sort of say, well, it's not really happening to me,
Right.
it's not really
So,
racism.
but what's the
I think that
solution?
psychologically we need to really understand that
Right.
we really have not progressed that much since the 60s.
But what I'm saying is we need to focus on, though, because we can say, I know it doesn't
Right.
exist, it hasn't been resolved, but how do we focus on the solution? Let's get to the solution.
Well, let's look at it this way. I'm not
Yes.
saying racism doesn't
No.
exist, because I'd be foolish to say
Right.
that. But when you look at every major city, except with maybe the exception of, say, Atlanta,
Right.
the majority of the police officers are Caucasian.
Okay.
I was on a specialized unit of 5. I was the only black officer. I patrolled black neighborhoods, not by choice of, I want to patrol the projects. This is
Right.
where I was assigned. So you automatically have an overwhelmingly large number of white officers
Right.
in black neighborhoods.
Okay.
Not necessarily they're there just because they want to,
Either,
attack the
yeah.
black man. It's just
Right.
demographics.
where they
So
are.
if that's
Right.
how then,
Do you
real
think the
quickly,
police
can I have some solution?
enforcement
Yes.
needs to be more diverse? Would that help?
Yeah, definitely. You need diversity when you're dealing with a
Within the
diverse
program.
group. Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Solution
Well, I
that
mean,
you can try to.
love, but you can't
Right.
impose that. So in the meantime, long term, you want to get rid of problems of income inequality and poverty. You got to get money out of politics.
Right.
You've got to go back to being a democracy and not an aristocracy and not an oligarchy. But in the short term, people need to cross lines. People need to dialogue. People, we
Yeah.
need to find. I mean, I thought it was disgraceful that those officers turned their backs on Mayor De Blasio.
Yes.
I did
They,
too.
after
Absolutely.
Officer Ray, it was a tragic murder.
And that's
you know
part of
what?
this-
If the NRA didn't make it really easy
Right.
for mentally ill people to get illegal guns that were once legal guns, those
Right.
cops would still be alive. And I think that we need to have a situation where you can have the cops not insulting all of New York, but by the same token, Mayor De Blasio now has to
Right.
cross some lines and try to mend those fences because
Right.
it's only through giving concessions that we can get
Right.
compromise, and people need to just demand their rights and stop
I'm
waiting for them to
loving,
come.
I'm loving this roundtable and the conversations that we're having here so much. It's wonderful. And up next, we're now going to go to the NFL because we know it's taken a hit this year due to the domestic violence incidents of Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson. When we return, we'll tackle how the controversy may affect the NFL, the players, and the fans in the upcoming years. Don't go away. This is an important Arise and Shine. the discussion keeps on continuing even when we're off air. Welcome back to Arise and Shine. We're continuing our first round table here, the most controversial stories of 2014. We're joined by John Fugelsang, Gwendolyn Lindsay Jackson, and Vincent Hill. Football was not always just a game, but a serious business in 2014.
A video of Baltimore Ravens player Ray Rice surfaced where he was seen beating his fiancée and now wife unconscious. Once it went viral, all eyes were on the NFL and how they would handle the situation. Ray Rice was suspended from play by the NFL, but appealed that decision and has now won back his right to play.
And running back for the Minnesota Vikings, Adrian Peterson, pleaded no contest to recklessly assaulting his son. He was fined, put on a probation, and deactivated from the team.
Vincent, I want to ask you, how much responsibility do you think the NFL should have for the actions of its players?
Well, it's twofold. You know, if I worked at McDonald's, I wouldn't expect them to get into my lifestyle. You know, the NFL is a corporation, and it's hard to hold them accountable for what their players do.
Right.
You know, they can't control them after Sunday night. Lights are off. They can't control what they do. But I will say, as far as domestic violence, especially in the Ray Rice incident, as a police officer, had I done that, my career is over. You know,
Right,
I can't carry a gun. I can't get traded to another department. You know, I can't go to another team.
Right.
So I think for that, when you invite Ray back, it sends a bad message to
Right.
women in general. And, you know, I watched that video and I looked at it and I said, you know, this isn't the first time this happened between those two. You know,
Right.
you don't just wake up after 28 years and decide to
decide to
start
knock her
beating
out in
women.
an elevator, right.
You know,
Especially the way it
yeah,
was.
Yeah.
I mean, the
It's
way
so
it was.
hard.
You know, I look what she did. I mean, she was, you know, assaulting him, which is no excuse by any means. You don't
not
hit
right,
a woman
right.
at all. But I think from their standpoint, it's not the first or the last time that
Right.
has
So
happened.
let's talk about Janae Rice, who was a victim but ended up also apologizing for her role in the attack. Why do so many people end up blaming the victim?
Well, I think in this country you have this sort of misogynistic, anti-feminist mentality, and it just trickles down to these women who are victims who feel that I could have done something else. It's my fault. And you
Right.
know what? When I saw some of the video after they were. Arrested, after Ray Rice was arrested, I think they had her in handcuffs too. I didn't understand why she was
Right,
ever in
she was.
handcuffs.
Yeah, she
that was
was.
terrible.
Right.
I mean, the woman could have had a terrible concussion. She could have had brain damage.
John, what do you think?
You know, earlier this year, George Will said that being a rape victim is a coveted status on campus.
Right.
And he still gets to have a job after saying that.
Right.
Right.
And we are in this blame a victim mentality and culture where it's magnified when being sympathetic to the victim can cost your boss some dollars.
Right.
Again, this is another case where, you know, we look at Ferguson, we look at Staten Island, we look at Cosby, we look at Ray Rice. We see, what do they have in common? Well, it's black people in trouble. Okay,
Right.
black men in trouble. But in all cases, we see the black men with money walk. The black men who have no power and jaywalk and sell loose cigarettes
Die.
are dead now.
Yeah.
Right.
So again, there's many, many layers to this, not just race. And ultimately, the NFL, I think, is to be derided for not caring about this. For Roger Goodell, who does about as much as a human appendix, turning a blind eye to the abuse of women. And if you're with a man, ladies, who wants to blame Janae Rice more than Ray Rice, it's time to find the exit.
Right.
Because this is contagious, this kind of thinking, and it's got to be shut down.
And you have to look at it like this. People will always say, well, she married him, so she must like it, or she must, you know, be used to it. So,
Right.
of course, they're going to blame her. Well, look, she married him, so, of course, you know, it's
Yeah, but
nothing to
But
it.
she loves him, and again, just like Camille Cosby, just like Hillary Clinton, I'm not going to besmirch anyone for honoring their wedding vows and forgiving their partner.
Right. And hopefully maybe it could be something that you can work on. So let's turn to the issue of child abuse, right? So you have, for which Adrian Peterson was indicted and given an indefinite unpaid suspension from the NFL. How should your employer be allowed to police your personal life? And you kind of touched on that for a
Already,
second,
yeah.
Vincent. Yeah.
Well, I don't think the Peterson case was child abuse. I mean,
Right.
I'm not going to say my age, but 30 years ago, my grandmother was spanking me with a switch. You know,
Right.
I mean, it was discipline.
Right.
Did it leave marks? Absolutely. But
Right.
I think Peterson was more the victim of the whole Ray Rice incident. Like, oh, this is happening in the NFL. We have
Right.
to do something now. We have to do something. I mean, the thing about Peterson, he admitted it. Yes, I did
Right.
spank my child with the switch. He did this, and I
Right.
disciplined.
And my grandmother spanked me with the switch.
Exactly.
And so on
and that
so
would have been
on.
me as well. You know, I can't tell you how many times I went to a call someone called the police to say, well, I got to discipline my child.
But is it a wake-up call, maybe, again, for the community as a whole? And when I say community, I'm talking about the African-American community in terms of changing some of its values that have been passed down through the generations
Gwendolyn,
and
what do you think?
generations.
No, I don't think so. I think what happened with Peterson, with the hitting of the child with the switch, I think it was a little bit too extreme. I mean,
Right.
a lot of people that are African American, they've been, whipped with switches and whatnot. But, when you start seeing bruises on the genitals of the child and, bruises and marks that aren't going to go away, I think it was a little bit too much. But I think the NFL does have a responsibility, and I think the responsibility they have is to do more life coaching instead of
Right.
just focusing on the athletics. Here you have these kids that are just out of college, and all they know is football. And you know what? They're playing football because some of them, they just want to get out of the hood. They want to be
Right.
able to buy their mom and dad a house.
Right.
They want to be able to live.
Yep.
And so they're not prepared.
So
and when
it's
they get to
changing
the
the
NFL,
mentality. That's what I'm talking about.
But
changing-
Absolutely.
I think that one of the fundamental differences between these guys and just an average person who has, another kind of employment situation is that these people are celebrities. And so, I mean, do you think it's right for celebrities to be put on a different platform? I mean, are they role models in some ways, and therefore they should be punished by their employers in addition to whatever happens in the court of law?
Well, as long as people want to be rich and famous and successful, celebrities will be role models whether we like it or not.
Right.
The fact is that if Adrian Peterson had run a dogfighting ring where animals were massacred, he'd be back playing now.
Right.
And I can't really comment on issues of child abuse and how in the black community what's cultural, just like in the white community. Some people think it's fine, some
Right.
don't.
Right.
But the fact is, if this was going to cost the NFL money, he'd be out. If it wasn't going to cost the NFL money, he'd
He's
be
gonna
playing.
stay, right.
And at the end of the day, that's the professional level we're working at here.
Right.
Which is why I think the NFL has an overwhelming responsibility to try to educate these new players coming in, making sure that I think they do have a responsibility to police these new
Right.
employees coming in.
I would agree with that. I mean, you have to look. They go from ashy to classy.
Absolutely,
Right,
that's
right.
right.
As soon as the draft is in, and
Right.
you don't leave that mentality behind. If you're not coached to say, okay, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to spend your
So-
money. This is who you need to associate with.
So
you
part of
lose
the
that.
solution then is to give that education.
Absolutely.
And there, what else would be a
Absolutely.
solution?
Absolutely.
What else?
Well, I also think that they probably need to strengthen some of the contracts that they
Right.
have with these, employees to make sure that they know what the boundaries are.
Right.
I mean, they are at-will employees, and you think they have a lot of leeway, but you have these issues that keep cropping up,
And
morals
and
clauses
also
and such?
morals
Moral
clauses,
clauses.
and also the
I would
issues
also
of whether
say-
or not you've been punished twice.
Right.
A lot of these
Double
contracts
jeopardy,
do
yeah.
not have the Fifth Amendment double jeopardy
Right.
And I would say
protections,
even
but they do have something
background.
similar to it.
Right.
Yeah, even background. I mean, look at Aaron Hernandez.
Right.
I mean, he was trouble in college, but they still
still
took him
s-
in.
right.
Yeah.
And look where he is now. So if you start looking at backgrounds and saying, I mean, if I apply for a job, the first thing they're going to do is check my resume. They're going to check my background,
Right.
criminal history and everything. So when you allow someone like Aaron Hernandez to come in the league, you get what you pay for in the end.
Right.
But you know what? Aaron Hernandez might have been produced in college, but had he had,
The
maybe
fundamental-
the fundamental
right.
things in college, I think in college, that's where it starts. They're
Right.
ignoring the mind, and they're basically just focusing on how fast can this guy run, instead of making sure
Right.
that they're
Right.
making good decisions.
Well, I think the good news is they have beefed up their domestic violence policy, so at least the dialogue was created because of these terribly unfortunate incidents. We have more to talk about with our guests. Coming up, our panel has their say. They'll share with us their most notable headlines from 2014. Stay tuned. You're watching Arise and Shine. Welcome back to Arise and Shine. Let's take one last look at today's headlines. Shahan?
Thanks, Priya. Here's what you need to know. New details are emerging about the passengers on board the missing Air Asia plane. 17 children, including one infant, were among the 162 people flying from Indonesia to Singapore. Officials say they lost track of the plane after the pilot asked to change course to bad weather. The authorities have halted the search until sunrise. This is the second missing plane crisis gripping Southeast Asia in less than a year. Paul Chapman has more.
At Surabaya Airport in Indonesia, from where AirAsia flight QZ8501 took off on Sunday, worried relatives were waiting for news of its fate. The aircraft lost contact with traffic controllers after the pilots asked to fly higher to avoid bad weather. There were at least 162 passengers and crew on board. Most were Indonesian. The airline says there were also 3 South Koreans and 1 each from Singapore and Malaysia. Indonesian transport officials say the plane disappeared between the port town of Tanjung Pandan and Pontianak town on Borneo. They said no distress signal was sent. The airline and Indonesia's Air Force are searching for the aircraft. Singapore says it's also mobilized its Air Force and Navy to help.
In another developing story, choppy seas and strong winds are hampering rescue efforts in Greece, where hundreds of people are trapped on a burning ferry. The fire apparently started on the deck as the vessel was heading to a port in Italy. Emergency helicopters and ships have been dispatched to the area. So far, more than 100 of the 525 people on board have been evacuated. No deaths have been reported. Flooding continues to cause havoc in Southeast Asia. More than 10 people have been killed and around 160,000 displaced in Malaysia. And across the border in Thailand, 14 people have been killed in floods that began in mid-December.
As residents in southern Thailand pull themselves to safety, officials warn that more flooding is on the way. Forecasters predict that the northeast monsoon will intensify in the coming days. In Yala, local authorities are preparing for rising water levels by reinforcing defenses. The floods have already affected more than 184,000 households and displaced nearly 8,000 people. Across Thailand's southern border, the number of people evacuated in northeastern peninsular Malaysia has jumped. More than 160,000 people have been evacuated as of Saturday, up from 100,000 on Friday. And with more rain on the way, that number is likely to increase.
The United States and NATO formally ended its 13-year mission in Afghanistan today. American and allied troops have been there since 2001. The occupation was a direct response to the September 11th attacks in the United States. Starting January 1st, the U.S.-led force will transition to a supportive role. Approximately 11,000 U.S. soldiers will stay behind to assist Afghanistan's armed forces, a somewhat small figure compared to 2010, when 140,000 American soldiers were based in that country. And here's a really absurd story. Public caning could become law in the Aceh province in Indonesia. This as lawmakers consider criminalizing gay sex. If passed, Indonesia's central government is not likely to make it a national law, but it doesn't have the power to strike it down if approved. In 2006, provinces were given the right to implement a version of Islamic Sharia law. Gay rights groups are, of course, unhappy.
Alah lagi kapan?
There's no restriction on living together, but it'll be a problem if they're married, he says. Getting married with the same sex is forbidden in Quran and Sharia law. However, if two people of the same sex are not married, they can live, eat, work and even sleep together in the same bed, as long as there's no sexual intercourse. Sharia law allows that.
So sad and so ridiculous. Back to you guys.
It really is.
The world is crazy. That's all.
Jinxed. I mean, well, thanks, Shahan. We've been talking about some of the biggest stories that made the headlines in 2014. Now we want to turn it over to our panel. What was the story that meant the most to you guys this year? John, let's start with you.
I think one of the most interesting stories to blend religion and politics here was the Hobby Lobby case, where they did not want to pay for birth control for some of their female employees, despite the fact that that's compensation under religious grounds, despite the fact that the Bible does not actually prohibit any kind of contraception.
Right.
I've read the Bible cover to cover. At no point does the Almighty ever say, "Thou shalt not wear a Jimmy hat." And it shows that Scalia law is a distant cousin of Sharia law when you can have conservative religion controlling social policy, especially when you consider the hypocrisy that Hobby Lobby outsourced its manufacturing to China, where abortions are mandatory. So they're really pro some life. So I do think that if we now live in a country where you can ignore laws because of your religion, you're move Rastafarians.
And Gwendolyn, so what for you was the most fascinating story?
I think unquestionably it's the Ebola story and the Tracy Hickox situation. This was a nurse who's from Maine who basically, she went to West Africa to do a good thing. She went to help people.
Yes.
She was not symptomatic. She was detained in Newark by Chris Christie. And I think that it's a very scary,
She didn't bring any Krispy Kremes.
But you know, I think it's scary because she was not symptomatic, and it just shows how your constitutional rights can be stripped away. And what if she were a poor black woman from West Africa without a voice? She had access to funds, she had access to media outlets, but I think this sets a very dangerous precedent, and which is why I think the New York governor backed away. Now, I think that what they could do, you can, because there is an incubation period of 21 days, you can certainly, demand that they're tested every day, whether it's by blood or by saliva, but what you cannot do is unilaterally just take away someone's constitutional right to freedom.
Got on her bicycle and said, I'm going to pedal away. She didn't, she said that this isn't okay.
But she wasn't symptomatic when she was pedaling away.
Well, but my point is that compared to all the other people who came back, she actually did stand up and say, this is not okay. You can't treat the Ebola workers like this. So that
and I think she did a great thing.
Yeah.
I think she did.
I think she was a little snotty, but other than that,
not as snotty as the Ebola illiterates.
That's true.
Well, and I think it's really cool that Time Magazine had their Person of the Year as the Ebola workers. I think that was really
this
a
year
nice tribute.
we learned Ebola is Latin for ratings.
Exactly.
All right, Vincent, what about you?
I would say the Michael Dunn case, the loud music down in Florida. It was compared to the Trayvon Martin case in the sense that the stand your ground law was used as a defense. But, there were some differences. You had George Zimmerman, who was the only witness to that shooting. But you had several witnesses to the shooting of Jordan Davis. And you have to look at his actions. He fired into the vehicle. As the vehicle's fleeing, he's shooting into the vehicle, and then he leaves and goes to the hotel room to order a pizza. So I think very callous.
Very sociopathic.
It just plays into his mindset. Like, what kind of individual are we dealing with to order a pizza after you just killed someone?
I'm guessing he never opened fire on loud country music.
So when I look at that case, I mean, that could have been me, 30 years ago when I was playing loud music. It's like, wow.
Exactly.
That could happen today. I still play loud music.
But I think the good thing about that case, too, was that it showed that it's not always that, the white man gets off the hook in these sort of stories.
Justice was definitely served in that case.
Yeah.
But we were all wondering how it would be served.
Yeah, because, the first time they had the mistrial and, they had to retry him. So, there was that question, like, okay, is he going to go to jail for this?
Is this going to happen?
So I have to tell you guys.
I hate to bring it back, that's because I think it was about racism.
Right.
And also about the fact that you had a predominantly white jury that really sympathized with Michael Dunn in a case as stupendous as this.
Well, and it's Florida again. I thought he was reaching for something, but he was reaching for a tape deck. Tape decks don't exist anymore.
And this is whole psychology of because you are black black, you have black skin, and you're a male,
Right.
you are dangerous. So the
Right.
person in their head, because they happen to be racist and afraid in their mind, they can act out on it and they don't have to go to jail.
So much,
I think that's scary.
So much right now about, like I said, in the world, 2014 is ending on, racial injustice and just in, our law enforcement, things we need to work on.
But I think it's an exciting time.
It is
because
an
really
exciting time. I think
is,
2015 will be good.
there's more dialogue happening, and hopefully that will lead to things changing.
And we had a
So-
dialogue here today, Priya.
Yeah.
Round table.
Did you have a favorite headline of this year?
You know what? From Ebola to Michael Brown to all of it, I think it was all just so major and
there's
big.
so much.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. This has been a truly fantastic first roundtable here at Arise and Shine.
Thanks to all of our wonderful guests for being here today. Stay tuned for an in-depth interview with former Secretary of Defense Robert